Es ist 29. Juni, 11:15 Uhr bei uns.
It's 29th of June, 11:15 in Germany.
Und bei Ihnen an anderen Orten wahrscheinlich eine andere Uhrzeit.
And in other places, it's a different time.
Aber wie schön, dass wir uns jetzt hier treffen können.
But it's wonderful to be able to meet today.
Herzlich willkommen an der Kirchlichen Hochschule zu diesem Vortrag.
And a warm welcome to the Protestant University in Wuppertal for this lecture.
Wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir in Kooperation mit der VEM wieder einen Global Talk veranstalten können.
We are really happy that we're able for a second time to have a global talk in cooperation with the United Evangelical Mission.
Diese Vorlesung ist zugleich Teil der praktisch-theologischen Vorlesung Diakonik.
This lecture today is being embedded into a lecture series at the Protestant University on diaconia.
Denn auch dort ist entscheidend, dass theologisches Nachdenken global betrieben werden muss.
And in diaconia, just as in other areas of theology, it's important to do theology within a global context.
So freue ich mich ganz besonders, Sie hier begrüßen zu dürfen, liebe Professorin Harris-Faller.
So I'm really happy to be able to greet you, Professor Dr. Jeaneth Harris-Faller.
Und ich danke auch schon jetzt Claudia Werisch-Oblau und Per Lindungan fürs Übersetzen und Leiten dieser heutigen Gespräche.
And my thanks to Claudia Werisch-Oblau, that's me, for translating, and to Dr. Anda Palindungan for being the moderator of this session.
An ihn gebe ich jetzt auch, weil er uns die Referentin vorstellen wird, uns allen einen erfolgreichen Vortrag mit vielen guten Erkenntnissen.
And I hand over to him now. He will introduce the speaker, and I wish us all a very successful lecture.
Dear students and professors at the Protestant University of Wuppertal, Bethel, it is my great joy to welcome you all, also the guests who are here. This is really a global talk that our audiences today come from different parts of the world. This global talk is a fruitful collaboration between the United Evangelical Mission and the Protestant University of Wuppertal, Bethel, in Germany. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Jeaneth Harris-Faller, the Dean of the Silliman Divinity School, Dumaguete, the Philippines. Welcome, Dr. Jeaneth. Thank you for your time of being here. Dr. Jeaneth will speak today with the theme, Why Theology Without Global Learning is Irrelevant. This is really a provocative and challenging issue for our theological institutions, students, and theologians around the globe. Before you start, Dr. Jeaneth, with your presentation, let me share shortly your biography. Jeaneth Harris-Faller is an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, UCCP, and is currently serving as the Dean of the Silliman University Divinity School, Dumaguete City, the Philippines. She teaches courses in biblical studies, Christian education, and liturgy. She completed her Master Divinity and Master of Theology from the Silliman University Divinity School and from the Southeast Asia Graduate School of Theology, respectively, in 1999 and 2001. In 2010, she finished her Doctor of Theology degree from the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Hong Kong. At present, she also serves as board secretary and at the same time part of accreditors of the Association for Theological Education in Southeast Asia, or ETHISIA. She was also a resource speaker for the ETHISIA Teachers and Women's Conferences, Christian Conference of Asia, Congress of Asian Theologians, and the United Evangelical Mission. Thank you also. And Rev. Dr. Jeaneth is truly an epitome of a woman who wears several hats. This is very interesting. A Christian educator, an international authority in liturgy and worship, a loving mentor for the ministerial formation students at the Silliman Divinity School, a doting wife and mother. Longer. Dr. Jeaneth, you have 45 minutes. Now time is yours.
So I greet you all warmly, and it's really warm here in my office this afternoon. This is where I am serving as the Dean of Silliman University Divinity School with the Ministry of Preparing Pastors for the United Church of Christ in the Philippines. It is an honor to be invited and included in the Global Talk series organized between the UEM and the Protestant University of Wuppertal and Bethel. The topic I will address today, entitled Why Theology Without Global Learning is Irrelevant, is particularly exciting to me because we are celebrating our 100th year as a seminary. And in connection with the celebration, I've been deeply involved in the journey back in time from where the seminary was founded, looking at milestone and realizing our historical roadmap has been deeply connected to global learning and the international community of faith. In this task, I will share from our experience of global learning the numerous reasons why it has proven to be important, necessary, and relevant. But to be honest and truthful to the topic, I will be remiss if I do not also address the many ways global learning can harm, disempower, and stifle theological development in the Philippines. My intention is to share both sides because I know I am speaking to the leaders and future leaders of the international community of faith. And I want to leave you with an understanding of the pieces of global learning that we should continue to nurture and promote. But I also want to point out pieces we should avoid and steer away from as we seek to move global learning to its most constructive and relevant role for the community of faith. Global learning has not always been relevant. I will reveal a personal fact about my age. In 1987, I was completing my theological studies at Silliman University Divinity School. At that time, we were all excited about an important event taking place in Spain, where church representatives from all over the world had gathered to culminate a 10-year process of establishing new and creative guidelines and perspectives on ecumenical resource sharing between churches and faith communities around the world. The conference is referred to as the El Escorial 1987 conference that carried the theme, Koinonia, sharing life in a world community. This was of great importance to us in the Philippines because it was attempting to expand the understanding of relationships between global partners. It was a serious attempt to redefine the historical understanding that what is shared between partners is limited to material wealth and the source of correct and legitimate theology is confined to the parent churches in the developed and wealthy countries of the Europe and the United States of America. This understanding had been passed down from the early colonial missionary era that founded many of the churches in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The United Church of Christ in the Philippines and the Silliman University Divinity School are both products of early mission from the United States of America. These mission churches from the United States slowly began to turn over control and ownership of this institution to the Philippines and Filipino leadership in the 70s. However, Filipino leadership, as it assumed its new role, were forced to adopt the model of the former American missionaries of reaching out to the parent churches in the United States for financial sustainability. Furthermore, they looked to the theology and scholarship of Europe and the United States as the legitimate, authentic, and the ultimate standard for theological schools, including Silliman University Divinity School. Therefore, while as students in the 1980s, we were reading emerging Filipino theology and witnessing indigenous liturgical music from Filipino theologians and liturgical musicians. We had been bound for so long to the parent churches in the United States, telling us in the Philippines the correct liturgy, worship, and theology, was found only, or we found only in their tradition. That we did not take our Filipino emerging theologies and liturgy seriously. There was a tendency to look at our emerging Filipino theology, liturgy, and music as exotic and entertaining aberrations and not real theology, therefore not formally acceptable in the seminary and the churches. For many years, Silliman University Divinity School has been trying to break this disempowering spell. We have built the Elena Maquiso Center for Liturgy and Music to foster indigenous liturgy and music. We have introduced at the seminary a Wednesday music worship focusing on teaching Filipino and indigenous hymns and instruments. But truth to tell, while our graduates are trained in Filipino theology alongside their classical Western theology and indigenous Filipino theology or liturgy and music, when I visit our graduates in their respective local church assignments, you will be surprised, and it saddened me to find out that less than a handful will challenge their congregations to integrate the indigenous Filipino theology, liturgy, and music into their churches. And the reason is that they inform us that the elderly in the church want it done, meaning the music, the liturgy, even the preaching, they want it done in how the missionary taught them. I believe you are beginning to understand my first point. Global learning has not always been relevant to empowering in indigenous Filipino theology, liturgy, and music. Global learning, when accompanied by teachers who assumed superiority, authority, and taught obedience and servitude to the one model they introduced from their powerful, wealthy foreign lands, can have a lasting negative effects on another people. Global learning and misunderstanding. After some years in the local church serving as a pastor, I was called back to the seminary for faculty development. At that time, a leading theologian in the Philippines and an experienced church administrator who was instrumental in the restructuring of the UEM from its former mission paradigm of from Germany to the world to the new United in Mission model was at the Divinity School. I was fortunate to come back to the seminary at a time when I would have the opportunity to learn from the experience of Bishop Ermi Arcamba, who navigated the waters of restructuring the UEM. And he is with us this afternoon or this morning. Bishop Kamba was deeply concerned about what he called colonization with a new face. This was taking place as financial institutions like the World Trade Organization and its instrumentality like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade were accruing power over nation states such as the Philippines to dictate and determine the destinies of their economies. The impact was being felt and the results were becoming evident as unprecedented concentration of wealth was accumulating in the global north and the intensification of increasing poverty in the global south. The world was further dividing into developed nations and developing nations, and the developing nations were recognizing the injustice of being left powerless and voiceless in this new world called globalization. The New World Order dominated much of the theological discourse at the time, and its name, globalization, became synonymous with the domination and the exploitation of the global south. For this reason, in the Philippine context, there is caution toward the use of the word global because it brings up images of inequity in favor of the wealthy and powerful. Let me share a concrete example in my work almost every day. The Association of Theological School or Theological Education in Southeast Asia, of which we are involved, was conceptualized under the principle of global learning in the 60s. It was a global learning principle to enable the sharing of academic resources among Asian seminaries to build up and strengthen the seminaries in Asia with the support of European and North American funding. The model of Atisea was successful for the first 25 years of its life. but there was fatal flaw that has left the Atisea schools today in a disparate situation. The model assumed that European and North American funding would continue without end, and this defined the priorities of how the monies would be used. The priorities were focused on improving academic facilities and resources, increasing faculty competence and scholarships. We benefited greatly from Atisea in these early years. But in the moments when a member seminary sought to establish an endowment fund or trust fund to make the long-term financial sustainability of the school more secure, the proposal was always turned down. A deeper inquiry into the reason for turning down such proposals was that it did not fall into the priority of the donor agencies in Europe and North America. Tragically, in 1993, the resources of Atisea began to run out. Suddenly, the member schools of Atisea had to begin to survive on their own, searching and seeking for their own independent funding from partners who would offer funds for pieces of their theological program. This hand-to-mouth existence that our schools are experiencing have made life incredibly stressful, but also we find ourselves adapting to the priorities of our donors to receive their funds. This leaves us with extraordinary little freedom to develop our own agenda and our own priorities in this global learning paradigm. The fact that we are excluded from the conversation determining the priorities of the donor agencies, this can lead to global learning being misunderstood as just another form of globalization. Global learning in the wrong company. Traditionally, an important role of the Divinity School Dean, and perhaps its most challenging role, is to support faculty development. When I was identified as a future leader and academic scholar by the seminary, the dean at the time, Bishop Kamba, was negotiating around the world to find the resources that would ensure my scholarship. As dean today, I am constantly working to find scholarships for our emerging leaders and scholars, and I don't want to note that the UEM has been among our most consistent and generous benefactors, for which we are greatly or deeply grateful. The importance of UEM to us is because of the common understanding we share about theology and the priorities of mission. To put it simply, UEM embraces a commitment to a holistic understanding of salvation, that salvation is the redemption of the mind, body, and soul. In the context of the Philippines, we cannot limit our theological understanding to solely the salvation of the soul in preparation for the afterlife, because there is so much suffering around us in this life. The church must engage the powers and principalities of this world, to ensure that there is life in its fullness, as Jesus models in John 10:10. We are grateful that the UEM affirms and supports the same understanding. There has been a growing clamor from some quarters of the world, as traditional donor agencies are presently finding their financial capabilities decrease, to turn to Asia for support. The call that it is time for Asia to support Asia has been heard, and the rationale is that there are newly industrialized countries in Asia, or sometimes referred to as the Asian tigers, that have emerged prosperous. This fact is true. There are countries in Asia that have emerged prosperous: South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, to name the leaders of the Asian tigers. However, two factors must be understood about the Asian tigers. The first is that Christianity is a minor religion in all these countries. Therefore, while there are new foundations and donor agencies in these countries, they are normally Buddhist, Muslim, or Confucian, and find little or no reason to support Christian endeavors. But secondly, and perhaps even more critical than the first, is the fact that Christianity in these countries have shared a common minority complex. Meaning, as a minority, they have prioritized their growth on the one hand and their caution on the other. In other words, they are driven by growth. And to grow, they believe they should stay theologically safe by avoiding a witness and theological direction that may cause them to be considered dangerous, unpalatable, and unwelcomed. The Christian movements and churches in the Asian Tiger Nation have reached out to us. They have offered areas of collaboration and support to faculty development. Many of our new and emerging theologians in the Philippines are finding opportunities to study in South Korea or Singapore. Unfortunately, they report back as a similar narrative that they are in the wrong company. Their pursuit of a biblical hermeneutic or theology that reflects a holistic approach to salvation finds little or no support. So you end up being isolated. No? You go to a particular country, bringing the theology that you have learned in your seminary, but when you go to the seminary, you find yourself being isolated. Because the kind of theology, the kind of vision, mission of the schools or the seminary that you go to or went to is so different from what your theology is. They are rather encouraged to learn the tools of church growth, a theology of salvation for the afterlife, and a conservative biblical hermeneutic, in short, safe theology. Consequently, we are drawn in because we desperately need scholarships and the opportunity to advance degrees, even if it means our young minds are being molded and their global learning is taking place in the wrong company. Global learning in the Exodus. Well, I have spent considerable amount of time outlining for you where global learning can do harm and prove to be a hindrance rather than a strength in moving us forward in creating seminaries and churches, growing in creative forms of worship and spirituality, expanding in methods of mission and evangelism, courageously advocating justice, peace, and integrity of creation, exploring new expressions of liturgy and theology, and advancing pastoral sensitivity and competence. Instead, the examples of global learning I have presented above have held us back in captivity to the models and mistakes of a former generation. But like our own biblical history, the church and her mission has been on a continuing Exodus journey. From the shackles of the old paradigms toward the land of new models and possibilities. I began my talk pointing out that pivotal moment in 1987 in El Escorial, Spain. The conference on ecumenical resource sharing on the theme, Koinonia, sharing life in a world community. I mentioned we were extremely excited because it was at this point that it felt the Red Sea had opened and finally we were crossing over and moving away from the old paradigms that had confined us and were holding us back. The El Escorial Conference brought together the historical sending and donor churches such as those from countries like Germany to sit alongside historical recipient churches such as those in countries like the Philippines. The sharing led to groundbreaking principles from which new paradigms for global learning could emerge and blossom. It affirmed a new way of looking at international or global relationships that was summarized in the slogan, all have gifts and all have needs. In other words, it was an affirmation after much dialogue and conversation that money was not the only gift and not the only need in the global community of faith. The former wealthy and donor churches of Europe and North America confided that they have needs that are not financial. They pointed out they have the need for a new generation of church leaders and pastors with commitment to breaking down dividing walls of hostility among people of different faiths and races, who understand the complicated issues of injustice around the world, who have cross-cultural sensitivities. They express the need to inspire congregations who have been dispirited by traditional confessionalism and left many churches empty. They express the need to learn new music and experience new liturgies from different regions of the world to give renewal to their congregations. It was a groundbreaking conference because it finally affirmed that the theologies, liturgies, and music of faith that Asia, Africa, and Latin America were nurturing through God's guiding hand were now being affirmed by the traditional authority and keepers of the faith in Europe and North America. With this affirmation also came a new sense of dignity. The old single paradigm of giving from global north to global south was transforming. There was now a recognition that the global south had gifts needed by the global north. I can recall the new sense of dignity we felt in the Philippines when we could sit across the table from our North American or European partners and no longer begin and end the meeting with asking for help, but instead offer the richness of our church experience, music, liturgy, theology, and even human resources to inspire and empower a new revival in the church life of our partners in the global north. Global learning, disrupting theology. You know, the Divinity School of Silliman University is located on an obscure island in the central islands of the Philippines. To reach any of the three major urban centers in the country, it requires crossing bodies of water and traveling some distance. However, in this day, when the urban centers of Manila, Cebu, or Davao are congested and at the limit of their capacity to enable a healthy quality of life, we are grateful that we are located upon this isolated island. But isolation has its own downside. Most significantly for the theological life of a seminary. The isolated island life can foster academic lethargy and the lack of initiative to keep abreast of the evolving theological discourse taking place around the world. It can occur that a faculty can continue teaching the same material that they accumulated back 25 years ago. The faculty are not completely to blame for this falling behind. It is also because we are not at the crossroads of the theological community in the Philippines where greater engagement between and among seminaries and academicians is possible. In the same way, accessing new theological books and resources is also difficult in isolation, aside of course from it's very, very expensive. Keeping the seminary library and the personal libraries of the faculty updated is a constant challenge. I will argue that it is for this reason that this has taken us longer to cast off the vestiges of the colonial pasts. It is comfortable and convenient to fall back and continue reading the Bible and articulating theology from the lens of the former generations when you are isolated. In isolation, it is safe and acceptable to train our students into clerical functionaries to administer the sacraments rather than to revise our curriculum into a program that nurtures more moral leadership, pastoral and spiritual competence, diversity, and equity sensitivities alongside theological and liturgical renewal that is occurring around the world or around the globe. It has been my fervent goal to push our faculty and move our seminary away from the tendency to fall back to what is comfortable, convenient, and safe. However, this has been a formidable challenge and a constant struggle. To break and disrupt the patterns that have been passed down and inherited from our isolated past is vital and urgent in response to changing circumstances and historical condition, lest we become irrelevant. It is in this context that I turn now to acknowledge and recognize that global learning, more than any other factor, has continued to disrupt the tendency to fall back to what is comfortable, convenient, and safe. Global learning continues to bring us out of our isolation, infusing us with new ideas, introducing us to new books, academic material, visiting scholars, and international students. It has shaken the foundation of our traditional, colonial, and patriarchal worldview and has expanded our curriculum toward new models of mission and ministry. Global learning and informal theological practice. Upon being affirmed and recognized in the global community that our evolving voices, ideas, liturgies, theology, ministries from the Philippines were needed, we began to heighten our engagement with churches and seminaries around the world beginning in the 90s. We discovered that there were two levels for which global learning could immediately take place and that both levels would affect the relevance of theology in positive ways. The first level I shall call informal theological practice. At this level, we began to pursue offering our seminary as conduit to an experience of the Philippines and her ministries for complementing the formal academic programs of students from around the world. The idea here was to invite students to the seminary for a semester or a term, or even just for a few weeks. We would create an experience of immersing the visiting student into the realities of the Philippines. I recall a young seminary student from the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, Junah Lim. He arrived and we found him a family to live with, a fishing community within our city. He stayed with us for one semester, and he lived his days with an impoverished family struggling to survive life with the limitation of fishing. We thought we were educating him, and we were. But as he came to class with our students, he was educating as well. His reports, his theological reflections, his analysis from the perspective of a Taiwanese living in a Filipino fishing community was so enriching to all of us. It gave our Filipino students a view of the Philippines from different eyes. It created a temporary cross-cultural learning experience that challenged us to see our reality in new ways. Our theological boundaries were expanded that semester, and today he is a pastor in Taiwan, organizing Taiwanese fisherfolk. And his best Filipino friend at the seminary has been elected to several leadership positions in our church in the Philippines. I would venture to say that the success that both their paths have taken was in part due to their global learning with each other. Another important process I would like to share has been an engagement we have had with Japan Biblical Theological Seminary. This process in global learning has our two seminaries alternating visits annually. 1 year, a group of students will come to the Philippines for a month, and the next year, a group of divinity school students, together with faculty, will travel to Japan for a month. The programs brought the students to various situations in each country and offered them opportunities to observe how the churches are ministering in these areas. But the unexpected impact of this global learning process was for me to observe how our Filipino students who were challenged to explain Filipino realities and theology to their new Japanese friends grow in wisdom and self-awareness. I was impressed how their minds were stretched, and in their effort to explain Filipino theologies to a people of different culture, they were understanding themselves and their own theology in new ways. A final model I will share at this level is a process we share with the UAM. This is the International Diaconate Management Program. You might be aware of this, but to describe it it is a process that brings young leaders of churches together, representing 7 or sometimes more countries from Africa, Asia, and Germany. The intention is to bring them together to the 3 regions, Africa, Asia, and Europe, to study with scholars from these regions and in these regions. It is an opportunity to learn how different countries approach the challenges of ministry and develop their strategies. In many respects, the take-home expected was to learn best practices from this global learning process. But after observing the process in the Philippines, I saw a different learning and take-home happening. The take-home was the challenge of surviving in a global village, working with people of different cultures and values and religious traditions and personalities and ways of expressing. The challenge was even greater because for a year you were unable to escape the group. You had to find a way to get along. You had to find understanding. You had to learn to process misunderstandings and reconcile all these qualities just to survive. The Filipino students that have graduated from this global learning process have grown significantly in their pastoral competence as much as in their management competence. They have come out of this process with the pastoral skills to be sensitive and empower rather than controlling or domineering. They have come out with the ability to mediate conflict and exercise the pastoral role of reconciliation. They have learned the ability to appreciate and understand the other or those different from them, not as a threat, but as enrichment as a result of global learning. Global learning and formal theological practice. I hope I can still indulge your attention for this last but important short section. I want to touch briefly on the impact of global learning on formal theological practice. I began our transition earlier affirming how global learning has disrupted our institutional tendency to fall back into our isolated patterns that inhibit theological growth and creativity. I would like to point out here how global learning has moved both our faculty and our seminary to greater competence and relevance in our theological practice. As I was coming to the end of my years as an undergraduate student, the Divinity School invited a visiting professor through the United Church of Christ, USA, in the name of Dr. Renate Rose. She was a German womanist theologian, and she was fierce and intelligent. We had not had much exposure to the analysis of patriarchy in the Bible and the harm it has caused theology in general and women in particular. She came prepared with books and materials, working to convince our faculty to allow her to teach a course on theology from the eyes of women. It was a clash of horns because our mostly male faculty and dean at the time were less than interested. It took her some time, but she persevered and broke through the male resistance. She taught with us for several years and complemented our library with new books and expanded our understanding and need to deconstruct patriarchy. Today, as a woman, I am the dean of the Divinity School, and we presently have 2 elected women bishops in our church. And I would like to argue that the rise of women leaders in our church is in part due to the global learning that brought womanist theology for the first time to our classrooms. Another such courageous woman that disrupted our theological comfort zone and pushed us forward in our thinking was Dr. Catherine Potig, an American theologian from California State University. She opened our eyes and enabled us to see for the first time a theological perspective that without her coming as a short-term visiting professor may have taken us many more years to embrace and appreciate. She brought to our classrooms the teaching of theology from the perspective of the LGBTQI community and challenged both students and faculty toward breaking down the prejudices that have kept the church divided and the LGBTQI community broken. She did not stay long, but she did complement our library with new material to continue the learning. Today, we include queer theology in our teaching and have church statement guiding the whole church in affirming LGBTQI community. During the time I was already teaching, the Divinity School received Dr. Gordon Zerby as a visiting professor. Dr. Zerby was from the Canadian Mennonite University and was surprised at the non-writing culture he observed at the Divinity School. He expressed his disappointment that the existing academic culture at the Divinity School that did not value the academic responsibility to publish. He felt that it is robbing the global theological community of an important voice and perspective. In his appeal to the faculty of the Divinity School, he mentioned that normally in theological schools, there is rule, publish or perish. Meaning that if you are not doing your scholarly writing for journals and books, you will not survive in the academia. To encourage us, he took on the role as editor of the Divinity School publication and challenged all the faculty to write academic papers for publication. It was the introduction of an especially important practice that we have adopted that arrived to us from the encouragement of Dr. Zerby, a global partner in global learning. I would like to close this section with just two more examples that are connected to UEM. As UEM transformed itself into the new paradigm of the United Mission, the Divinity School has been the recipient of her South-to-South faculty sharing. Initially, we were fortunate to receive outstanding scholars from Indonesia to teach alongside our faculty. Then more recently, we have received outstanding faculty from Tanzania. It is to the latter that I want to speak, the coming of the Tanzanian faculty. The particular importance to our students and even to many of us in the faculty is our unfamiliarity with the people of the African continent. Important barriers and stereotypes had been broken, and race relations had been nurtured in the bringing of scholars from Tanzania. In a world shaped by worldwide racism, our students have not been immune from developing implicit biases based on race. Our inherited theologies, our biblical images, and even our global partners had been overwhelmingly white, and our students have learned to admire and emulate whiteness. Suddenly, we come sitting in a classroom with an African scholar whose wisdom we come respect, who invites us into their home for a community gathering, who encourages us, who teaches us. Biases are broken down. There is the beginning of a dismantling of racist perception and attitudes in all of us. Global learning, with the coming of our Tanzanian siblings, is shaping us and our theology into greater maturity. Finally, I want to mention the role of a wonderful couple the UEM has supported for short-term faculty assignments in the Philippines, Peter and Sylvia Bukowski. They're both retired from important church roles in Germany and bring with them many years of experience as they share time with us in the Philippines. They bring a special area of expertise that are weaker competences in our curriculum. Their concern is that to be relevant in the world today, we must move beyond preparing seminary students for intellectual and ministerial professionalism. We must instead develop the character qualities of each student to be committed, effective, spiritual, and intelligent persons at the service of God and the whole community. Knowledge of God, therefore, is not measured by the information one possesses, but by how one lives their life and treats their neighbor in response to God. These valuable and important insights have challenged us to strengthen our spiritual formation and pastoral care programs to build up the qualities of characters in our students. Another gift of global learning to making our theology more relevant in the world today. Theology without global learning is irrelevant. Friends, I have tried to offer examples of how global learning can both harm and strengthen the relevance of theology. In another way of speaking, global learning can both be relevant and irrelevant to theology. I believe we are moving forward and away from the harmful and irrelevant paradigms of global learning But we must continue to call them out and remind ourselves not to walk the path of the old or of old, to forget the mistakes we have committed may we only lead to repeating the harm in the future. In the tradition of our faith, we are called to metanoia, a turning away from the ways that bring harm, and we must always be in pursuit of the good. We worship a God of all people and all creation, whose concern is always for the good of all nations. Our God would expect nothing less from us than to give every voice the respect of inclusion and acceptance. It would be a disgrace to our God to arrogate all truth to one region or one people of the world and to shut out and silence others. But our God would also expect that we submit all our global learning paradigms to the test of global redemption. A global learning paradigm that is redemptive for some but subjugating and destructive to others will not be acceptable. You are the next generation. We leave both our mistakes and our best practices in global learning in your hands to further develop. May you be guided to enhance global learning so that our theology is enriched with the vibrant and creative voices of all God's people. May your efforts move us toward a new world where all God's people shall live in peace and harmony with one another and with creation. Thank you very much.